When looking for infrastructure lessons or lessons over infrastructure pipelines, the experience of our next keynote speaker is particularly invaluable in an Australasian setting. Peter Colaccino is a principal at Modifica Advisory and the former Chief Policy and Research at Infrastructure Australia. This session is sponsored by Fulton Hogan, so before Peter comes out and addresses us, they have a short video for us all.
What does it mean to be part of the community?
Being part of the community is all about people willing to put their hand up and help and getting on and getting things done.
Being part of the community means being there for each other, showing each other love and warmth and being genuine.
To me, being part of a community is all about supporting each other, looking after each other and caring for each other.
In the aftermath of Cyclone Gabrielle, the catastrophic floods on the west coast, the severe storm events in Nelson and the anniversary weekend floods in Auckland, communities came together to help those in need. Neighbours, residents groups and local marae. People like these neighbours in Hawke's Bay and our Fulton Hogan family. Because we're more than just a construction and infrastructure company, we're part of the community. Our 6,500 people live here too. We call Aotearoa New Zealand home. And we're neighbours who always put people first, who just get on with helping others. Like when Cyclone Gabrielle hit, we knew we had to act fast. We didn't wait for a call or an invitation. We put our hands up, our hard hats on and got to work, like any good neighbour would. And we're not about to stop there, because good neighbours also think about the future of their community. Which is why we're working to prepare our country and the infrastructure our communities rely on day in, day out, so we can overcome the challenges we know are ahead. We're already active in land development, building communities and their assets for the future. We're maintaining and enhancing the reliability of our transport networks, keeping people moving from the top to the bottom of the country. And we're leading the way in water infrastructure, operating and maintaining water assets to protect and enhance the quality, reliability and accessibility of our precious water supplies. All these combine to ensure more resilient infrastructure for our communities, our country and for future generations. After all, what are neighbours for?
Well, what a wonderful introduction to presenting after lunch. Thank you all, after afternoon tea I should say. Thank you all for hanging around for this session. I am going to talk a little bit about policy and I'm going to talk about Australia, unfortunately, rather than focusing on New Zealand. So bear with me. I'm glad that you stuck around in order to hear about it. I'm very keen to share a little bit, frankly, of war stories with you about what we got wrong, because it's not all right on the other side of the ditch. There are a lot of things that we don't quite land. And rather than reinventing the wheel on a number of those areas, why don't you benefit from 15 years of mistakes and not make those same mistakes yourselves? So I just want to start with this little bit of sort of time machine travel, a little bit of self-reflection. Did you know that it was in 1989 that the World Wide Web came into effect? 1989, so, you know, nigh on 40 years ago, getting around there. 2000, Google took off, you know, overtook Yahoo, but actually, we started using search engines and really interacting with the web in a different way. 2007 was the iPhone. And now in 2023, it's ChatGPT and AI that's sort of taking over this idea of exchanging information and knowledge and data. And fundamentally, I could have banged up this presentation in 5 minutes or so using ChatGPT, but instead, of course, I poured my heart and soul into it. But the journey that I'm explaining to you is a journey or a period of time over which productivity in our sector has reduced. It hasn't improved. It hasn't even plateaued. In that period of time that we've had knowledge in our hand, the ability to talk to it and for it to prepare insights for us, our sector has fundamentally gone backwards. And I think that that's a significant challenge for us and one that we need to overcome. And as a researcher and a policymaker for me, it's about understanding how we can deploy data and knowledge in a timely, accurate, and also efficient way so that we can inform decision making. And it's also a really interesting reflection of time, because it was in 2007 when the iPhone was first being rolled out that Infrastructure Australia was created. So this independent body with a view across the sector that I've personally spent 5 years contributing part of my life to. And unfortunately, that independent advice fundamentally has not transferred the sector into highly productive, highly impactful. In fact, it's over that period of time that the productivity declined. So I do think there's something in not just offering independent advice, but making sure that we're deploying data and knowledge and evidence, which is really critical to driving the change. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how IA is perhaps going backwards and avoiding realising some of the successes that we began the journey to. And I'd really like you to reflect on it in the context of where New Zealand's going, and particularly in the context of the infrastructure priority list. So it's really in this environment that I would say data-led or evidence-led policy making is critical. And in fact, I see it as the evolution of the infrastructure body globally. So IA was the first. It was an experiment. And it was born from the idea out of Infrastructure BC, British Columbia, and Infrastructure Ontario. Very different entities. They're involved in project delivery, but they just work across a variety of infrastructure sectors. IA was unique. Independent advice, independent assurance and scrutiny. This word independent featured incredibly heavily. It was to sit across our states, and let's not forget, very different to New Zealand, the centre of our country is in our states. Our constitution was our states giving power to our Commonwealth. They chose the things that they would hand over, and most importantly, they chose the things that they would not. So our states are very free to pursue their own investment program. They are the major deliverers of infrastructure. And to give you a sense of scale, our largest project's over $100 billion, being Suburban Rail Loop, which is equivalent in scale to the entire investment pipeline in New Zealand. And our investment program of individual state transport agencies, like Transport for New South Wales, is $100 billion a year. So the scale of our sector is very large. More than 2/3 of investment is in transport, and 87% is in the eastern seaboard states. So the states hold a great deal of power. But after IA was formed, over a period of time it was reviewed in 2013 in order to, as was suggested, add to that independent flair. And again in 2023 with the same purpose, so just very recently. But despite this focus on independence, the organisation has become a political football. So it shifted the debate to some degree away from projects and more to the role of the organisation, and debate over mandate and tools and processes, timeliness and application. So the focus has shifted fundamentally to policy. Where we have seen organisations succeed and achieve, and I would argue it is the case in New Zealand, we see Te Wahanga as a strong organisation that is built into the framework of infrastructure in the country today. It's where they've served one government, and they've been able to balance this notion of independence, the supposed focus, with something of much greater value, which is influence. Now, you'll probably not be able to read this, particularly if you're up in the nosebleeds, but the thing that this diagram is designed to point out is that fundamentally with the proliferation of bodies, so too there's been a proliferation of responsibilities. However, there is some consistency around long-term infrastructure strategies and investment prioritisation. And on top of that, I would say there have been some consistent challenges. So changes in reporting line, including Te Wahanga on this slide from when it was prepared, and also levels of independence, with organisations like IA swinging between independence and then back under the control of a minister who is fundamentally seeking to expedite processes. The argument for reduction of independence is always expediency. The core role of these bodies as independent bodies is therefore tenuous, and we need to think about the value from independence versus the value of collaboration, cooperation, and independent decision-making rather than independent work. This slide builds on that list of responsibilities and again focuses on this notion of commonality and indeed, as well as those long-term plans and prioritisation, assessment of business cases and investment assurance are generally common areas of focus for independent bodies. And indeed, that's an opportunity New Zealand's looking to exploit through its priority list. So we've heard Minister Woods, who's identified and flagged those roles, so investment prioritisation, assurance of high quality projects, in her presentation over the last few days. However, I would ask you if there's a large bridge in a city that will be invested in regardless of a view around the business case. Because if there is, indeed already before this reform has been implemented, there's a degree of duplicity in the way that it's being discussed. And a strict view of applying a framework that delivers consistent value is the only way to lasting reform and change. So it is critically important that the IPL doesn't exist in isolation from broader government investment decisions and that it leverages existing practice and also delivers broad value. So despite this notion where I started of increased access to data and information and indeed ChatGPT helping thousands or perhaps millions of teenagers globally with their homework, we have this growing informal decision making. So we have this role of ministers working around agencies and practices, and indeed we have a focus on opinion and politics. So it's very important to think back on why those changes are occurring, why indeed policy is undervalued, and I would argue particularly undervalued in a sector like this, a sector known for acting quickly and building big things, inherently doesn't like long documents and hefty plans. And we've heard that again today. I've heard a focus on expediency. Again, it breeds a move away from independence. I've heard a focus on expediency, which moves away from informed, evidence-based decision-making. And I would really encourage all of you to think very clearly about ensuring continued investment and a pipeline of work in the short term, but also around building a robust and stable framework that can ensure investment over the long term. And the reason why that is critical is because policy shapes entire markets. Projects very clearly affect the lives of individuals, whether it's a person consuming water or someone traveling in a car or bus. Indeed, very large projects affect a great deal of people. However, policy reform has the ability to shape nations and to shape industries and has lasting long-term change. So I again would say over the last day, we have a real example of that. I saw the poll earlier, in fact, I think it was the first poll around attracting private finance to the industry in Australia, immediately following Minister Woods, who indicated the government was a big supporter of private investment. However, the poll from all of you in the room suggested, I think more than half of you felt that it was the critical challenge. Government adoption or government position was the critical challenge in attracting private capital. So that it is very clear of the opinion in this room that you see the challenge that misplaced policy, a few words can make to the shape of the sector, and indeed the importance to policy overall. So what does best practice policy mean? Well, here is an example, and I have to say I would point to Infrastructure New Zealand's Infrastructure as a Strategy report and the analysis around Scotland and Ireland and Hong Kong. Indeed, some of those countries are benchmarks we used in Australia as well for shaping our audit and plan and infrastructure priority list. But there are a couple of very simple ambitions that best practice policy should pursue. First and foremost, and this is one thing I've very positively heard repeated over and over these last 2 days, is the idea of starting with a vision and outcomes, and indeed they can be defined by value and principles beneath them. It is inherently something that Australia has not done. We do not have a consistent set of national values. We have some states with a document called Premier's Priorities that allows us to have a true north. But starting with a vision and outcomes, and indeed I would say New Zealand focusing on that issue should be your priority. And it is an ask of politicians which is very opportune in the shadow of an election in September. You should be asking your politicians for their areas of focus. Will it be a school to improve educational outcomes? Would it be a hospital to improve health? Or would it be improve freight network productivity to grow the economy of the nation? They are questions for politicians, and they are questions you should ask your politicians to answer. You should understand current performance, informed by data, both held by government and industry and third party. Access to data is the fundamental defining feature that should be involving productivity of our sector from where it was in 1989. We should understand gaps between where we are today and where we would like to be in the future. As I mentioned on the panel a moment ago, our minimum service levels that we're prepared to accept for communities across this country, and indeed how this country fits into a global set of benchmarks. We should plan, and within the plan, we should consider interventions, because projects and reforms are exactly that. They're interventions within a system, an established complex system with natural environment, built environment, societal layers and regulations piled on top. A project doesn't exist in isolation despite our best efforts and some very tall cones you have in New Zealand compared to Australia, which I don't understand why. But an intervention is indeed an intervention in a system with cascading impacts, and it's fundamentally critical to understand first how to deliver those with the minimum call on resources, which is inherently a non-build option. And then finally, something we are all terrible at, which is reporting on progress and understanding the effectiveness of change. Now, I'd just like to layer the infrastructure in Australia environment across that best practice to give you a sense of why I would say Australia is an early mover, an early adopter, but not perfect. So within Infrastructure Australia's environment, we originated that organisation in 2013, post-reform, with a couple of key documents at the bottom of this slide. Some policy papers providing deep dive analysis, an audit or needs assessment. I will tell you, in the first audit, we had to consider and reflect ourselves whether it was a financial audit, an audit of asset quality, or indeed something different. I've been through that journey, and it was significant. And those questions being asked within an agency are not consistent with an outcomes-focused way of reform. We moved through our plan, which was conceived as non-build reforms, however, has morphed into informing the infrastructure priority list, and then a set of business case evaluations informing a priority list supported by a consistent assessment framework. All of those documents then complement a new piece of work, the Infrastructure Market Capacity Assessment, which gazes across the sector, both civil construction, private engineering, and home builds to understand the capacity of the sector to deliver. And for instance, the types of insights that document allowed the government to see into was that 1 in every 2 construction roles in Australia will go unfilled this year. So if you're working in our industry and you turn to your colleague, they're not there. You're looking 1 seat away. The result is people are acting up in areas beyond their skill. People are working in areas that they're not necessarily the most productive and further dragging down the productivity of the sector. It's the level of work, it's that strong investment, it's the focus on transforming our nation in ways that perhaps are not efficient and effective, which is driving that over-call on resources, that fundamental drain on the ability of the nation to deliver. We also found through this set of work at IA that pointing out problems, indeed the role of the audit, and to some degree the role of our business case analysis, is not a productive path for any government agency. You make a lot of enemies, but not a great deal of not a great number of friends. So fundamentally, organisations in that space need to be resourced in order to invest in developing new insights and value in order to drive change. So for an organisation involved in developing a priority list, for instance, they need to be able to deliver meaningful value to the proponents bringing those projects forward, so they want to engage. At IA, it evolved into this policy cycle of needs assessment, of reform, non-build solutions, considering the built, as I've said, through the priority list, and then ultimately the market capacity project. But indeed, all of those pieces of work were top-down and not guided by a clear vision of the future. Around a year or so ago, this is where we had reconciled ourselves. So we'd come to a place where our policy environment was fundamentally far more complex. We were interested in problems and places and solutions and delivery, and we had a series of both outputs, documents to do that, tools or consistent methodologies in order to unlock consistency and impartiality. And they were underscored by a series of principles, guardrails, in the absence of a set of nationally consistent outcomes or value. So we moved through this process at IA of fundamentally trying to understand our nation, our communities, the interventions, and then the priority with which those interventions should be implemented, finally through to our market capacity project. Indeed, our audit transitioned from 2015, the first, when we were wondering what an audit was, through to our second in 2019, to be integrated, place-centric, to include social infrastructure for the first time, to focus on service outcomes, not projects, and to embed outcomes as the focus of that document. Indeed, our policy environment became increasingly complex, with needs assessments compounded by COVID and performance reporting, through long-term plans broken by sector, prioritisation and implementation. And while this process of reform was indeed meaningful and impactful, it was complex and isolated our audience, an audience of politicians and community members who fundamentally were seeking simplicity and an understanding of how to drive transformative change. Our priority list similarly became complicated, over 200 projects, a lack of focus on outcomes, extremely broad sectoral coverage, and a method for prioritisation that was opaque and narrow, focused on cost-benefit analysis and a defensive cost-benefit analysis, an environment of not understanding that that tool is not the preferred way of prioritisation across a number of sectors. The priority list also lacked a so what. 200 projects on the list, many there for more than a decade. Was the government bound to invest in a way consistent with the list? And indeed, if the government was bound, was it affordable? So last year, with a new government, a new Labor government federally, and despite bipartisan support for the agency and its role as independence, there was a question about an evolving role for advice. Were projects designed to be impactful, high BCRs? Were they designed to be affordable and deliverable, small bite-sized chunks? Were they transformative or incremental? Because there are a number of roundabouts, bus priority lanes, and indeed curb and guttering projects across the nation that can drive impactful change. Or were we about projects like the National Broadband Network, the transition to hydrogen production, and indeed the Net Zero Challenge? Well, our minister offered a view. The minister's view was to focus on expert advice, I would say not evidence, to empower some long-term IA stakeholders, a previous board member and department secretary to review. She was focused on big challenges or back to problems. She was focused on advice within the Australian government, not informing community debate. She wanted to review the outputs, the product suite. She wanted to reduce the independence through a new governance framework. And she wanted to clarify the mandate, I would say perhaps the best piece, through a clear purpose. The review of IAA has achieved many of those things. The advice of the agency is now within government. It has reduced independence through 3 commissioners. I would say 3 commissioners with 4 sectors of focus: telco, energy, water and transport. So there are some unicorns in there. Commissioners yet to be appointed, but some large challenges for them. And equally, a focus on methodology rather than solutions or projects, and indeed this focus on a consistent approach between governments and internal to government advice. So IA has shifted, again, back to this idea of advice rather than data. However, that advice has moved within government with reduced independence and scrutiny. The move in the agency has been away from that initial intent around driving public discussion and dialogue and towards intervening within government. And I would say that that journey has been driven by the dislocation between government and industry. Industry's ambitions are indeed far different, and here they are. Industry is focused on a consensus view and a way forward. It's focused on national problems with local place impacts. It's focused on a build-out from data, 3 areas that have not been the focus of the reform. They're also interested on the future and linking reform and investment, which are indeed part of the change. But I would challenge a discussion more broadly to say, with this difference between the view of government and industry, will the reforms be lasting? Will they likely see beyond the current term of government? And indeed, I think not. I think IA will be reformed again, perhaps on the change of government, perhaps sooner. And what we need in that framework is a clear view of best practice. We have muddled through with IA being the first, but now in a crowded industry of independent advisors with rich access to data at our fingertips, there's an opportunity for a fundamental change in the role of the organisation. So how do we get it right? How do we shift? And indeed, policies change often, and they should. Governments, as democratically elected governments, as we have in both New Zealand and Australia, should be able to choose priorities and to drive a vision. And indeed, that's the place where politics belongs. Politics doesn't belong in delivering projects out there with hands on spades and shovels, not even golden shovels. Where hands of politicians belong is in setting outcomes and working with their bureaucracy to design frameworks to achieve them. This idea that policies are many, but principles will not change, and indeed for political parties, their ideology replaces the word principles. So thinking about the Australian environment and who perhaps has got it right, many people would not point to the Northern Territory, but indeed our smallest jurisdiction has designed a framework which is led by a long-term strategy with vision and purpose, objectives and actions, updated every 4 years to align with the reality of democracy and political cycles. Democracy may not be perfect, but it is the best we have. It is underscored by an audit or a needs assessment, a plan to drive reform, and indeed a pipeline of priorities to drive the certainty that can be driven in an inherently uncertain world. How might we take the lesson of the Northern Territory and apply it more broadly? Well, we should start with asking ourselves some questions. Where are we headed? Where are we now? How will we get there? And how are we tracking? 4 simple questions, underscored each by some pieces of work, which start with this very important point of political leadership around a vision and defined outcomes. Outcomes for lasting change in the community. A balanced scorecard. You may choose to use something like the Sustainable Development Goals, which most of the countries in the world have signed on to, and would give us a really interesting international benchmark of performance, I have to say, if we all subscribe longer term, to define measures. Indeed, there's an opportunity to understand current state through an audit, as we have in IA, to understand gap analysis through a needs assessment, and then drive through a plan, through options, solutions, and ultimately a sequenced action list where we're considering value for money and effectiveness in driving change in making decisions. Finally, we should report on progress and we should hold ourselves to account. And this is not about holding government to account, it's all of you in the room as the infrastructure leaders of this country to driving this transformative change. Difficult change must be achieved together. It must be achieved through collaboration. And I encourage all of you to seize this moment ahead of the next election. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was fantastic. Several questions have come through. I know we are tight on time, but I'm just going to put a couple to you now. What is your view on the independence of Te Waihanga, the New Zealand Infrastructure Commission?
My view on independence of agencies generally is that the independence needs to be protected both by legislation and also by a ring-fence budget. If you have an organisation that's dependent on another for funding, it will inherently be compromised. So for Te Waihanga, I think a strong, clear mandate with strong, clear resourcing is really fundamental to success. I would see independence as being part of the process, but again, it's not independence from government, putting itself on a rock and shining a light on problems. It's about working with government to enable them and bringing an independent, i.e. an impartial view to decision making.
What has been the impact of those multiple Infrastructure Australia reviews?
Terrible confusion is the starting point. So Infrastructure Australia, created in 2007, the idea was state governments would submit their long-term plans and IA would roll it up into a national document. In fact, with the global financial crisis hitting a year later, 50 billion or so was given to the agency to distribute to critical projects, and they asked for another round of submissions through business cases. So that first process had achieved nothing, and indeed this new process was critical. So now, generally the public, the media, and indeed many governments look to IA to hand out money when there's none left. So the result is there are a bunch of terribly confused stakeholders looking to the organisation and the priority list to unlock funding, whereas it is absolutely not its role.
Over the last couple of days, you might have noticed there's been a lot of conversation about the role of iwi Māori in infrastructure development and future planning and funding in New Zealand. I wondered, among the complexity, coverage and prioritisation of everything, what role did Indigenous and Aboriginal communities play?
Great question. So the first thing to say is that there is a fundamentally different situation. There are over 600 Indigenous nations within Australia, different language, different priorities and different ways of working, also varied skill and institutional capability. So we have a different challenge. I would say, though, that our largest Indigenous communities are Mount Druitt and Randwick, so they're in Sydney. They're not central desert populations. But central desert populations have no access to clean drinking water, or 1 in 5 people don't have access to clean drinking water. There's issues with telco and roads and energy and everything else. Really what I would best describe as third world conditions. So when we talk about Indigenous participation, we need to consider the diversity, and we do need to create opportunities. And IA has done work on both lifting social equity and economic outcomes for Indigenous populations in the past. And the conversation at the moment is, of course, giving Indigenous Australians a voice to Parliament. And there are some real substantive and live questions about what that means for infrastructure delivery. If, for instance, Indigenous people can lobby the executive of government, they could lobby a project director for a change. That would be within their power and remit. So stepping away from that and thinking about the intention of the voice is an important decision.
Finally, what is the right time frame and the right number of projects for the New Zealand priority list?
That's, again, a really interesting question. And it needs to be pegged against affordability envelopes. So there's no point having a list that will take 100 years to deliver. And if a list, in fact, will have that outcome, then the parameters of the list are wrong. What the ambition should be is to define the outcomes that I've mentioned, to understand the budget headroom that will be afforded to driving those outcomes, and then to prioritise based on value and effectiveness. And there are tools to do that, both at a macro level and also at a project level through approaches like should cost. But ultimately, it is fundamentally critical to understand what's trying to be achieved and then the ability to fund it.
Fantastic. Hey, great presentation. That was superb. Thank you so much. Join me in thanking Peter Colaccino. Thank you so much. Well done.